This is Scott with Places. What we'll be taking a look at today in this video is how to manually create data sources or data connections from your custom Places app form to a specific SharePoint list. Now, if you've previously watched one of my videos called Creating SharePoint List Forms, then you know with Places it's extremely easy to create a custom form for your SharePoint list. You simply select the List tab from the ribbon. On the right, there's a Places App Forms button. Select that. And finally, click Manage List Forms. That will launch the App Forms Designer. A basic form design will be laid out for you automatically. A data source back to the list is created, and the insert, select, and update commands of that data source are also pre-configured for you. So at that point, all you have to do is publish the form back to the SharePoint list and you're done. You have your custom form for your SharePoint list. But what if you wanted to do all those steps by yourself? In other words, start from scratch and create everything on your own. How do you do that? Well, that's what this video is going to show you how to do. Now, we will be using this company info list. We will be submitting or saving our data back to this list, and eventually we'll be setting our custom form to be the form for this list. But as of now, this list is simply using the built-in SharePoint list forms. We have 5 columns in our demo list today. Company name is simply the default title column that I've renamed to be company name. And then I've added city, state, zip, and phone. So how do we get started creating our form and adding the data sources? Let's take a look at that. I'll switch over to my App Forms Designer, where I've started to lay out just a few items for our form. I've added some labels and then some text boxes to collect the data, and those text boxes, of course, correspond to the columns in our SharePoint list. So there's a text box for company name, there's one for city, state, zip, and finally phone. I also have a save button on my form already, and that's what we'll use to save or submit our data back to the list and then of course update existing data. So now the next step is adding those data sources. How do we begin to create the data source and add the insert, select, and update commands? Let's take a look at that. To start the process of setting up a data source using Places, we need to begin that by using the Create Data Source button here in the upper left-hand corner. So I'll click that. This launches what amounts to be the data source wizard. So the first thing that we need to do is provide a name for this data source. I use a naming convention that starts with DS, short for data source, and then a name that's representative of what this data source is doing, or where it's going maybe. So I'll do DS Company Info as the name of my data source. The next thing we need to do is provide the type of data source this is. Is it going to SQL or a web service or SharePoint? Well, for this demo, we know it's going back to a SharePoint list, so I'll choose SharePoint from that option list and click OK. The next screen shows you all the lists that are available in your site collection. We know that we want this to go back to company info, so I'll select that and click Next. Now here is where we start setting up the commands for this data source. In other words, the insert, the select, and the update commands. So we're going to start off with the insert. So I'll select that from our drop-down box and click Add. Now what this screen is for is to allow you to map the fields that are on your form to the columns that are in the SharePoint list that we selected, the company info list. So along the left-hand side are all the columns from that list. What we need to do now in these boxes is just specify the fields from the form that map to those columns. So as an example, company name, we know that's going to map to TXT company name. City would be TXT city, and so on. So I'll just finish those very quickly. And finally, phone. Okay. Now you'll notice I did not add a control to the form design for adding attachments, so we don't have to map that one. And the ID column, remember with SharePoint, the list item ID is automatically generated for us, so we don't need to map that either. So from an insert perspective, we have mapped all the columns that we need to, so we're done. So we'll click OK here. Now the next step is adding a trigger. When do we want this data connection to be executed? Well, we want it to happen when the user clicks the Save button. So to do that, we'll click the Add Trigger button. We'll select our button called BTN Save and click Create Rule. Now when I click that Create Rule button, it's going to automatically generate the rule to execute that data source command. And I'll show you that in just a moment. So I'll click Create Rule. And there you can see that that was generated. And at this point, we're done. Our insert command of that data source, that process is finished. So we'll go ahead and click the Finish button here. And before we test this, let's just take a quick look at that rule. So we do have just one rule at the moment in our form here called on_button_save. That was generated for us automatically from that trigger process. You'll see that when the button is clicked, we're going to execute this function called execute command. We're going to use our data source that we created, and we're going to call the insert command to add that record to the list. Okay, let's test that process out. We'll go back to the designer, click Preview Form. I'll take just a moment to add some sample data. Okay. And when we click Save, this should submit or save that data back to our company info list. All right, let's take a look. We'll switch over to company info, refresh our page, and there is the record that we just added. So the next step now would be how to select this record if we wanted to, say, click on these ellipses and edit or view that item. How do we do that? Let's take a look at that. So I'll switch back over to our designer, close this preview, and now the next step is going to be to modify our data source to add the select command. We would do that by clicking the Edit Data Source button right here. But before I go through that process, I want to take a moment and just talk with you about SharePoint functionality in general, and how does SharePoint know which list item that we're actually looking at or editing. So I'm going to switch back over to our SharePoint list for just a moment. And if we were to click the ellipses next to this item and choose either Edit or View Item, when that item was displayed in the URL for that item in the address bar of the browser, you would see a number of query parameters, but one of those is a query parameter called ID. So for instance, if we were looking at list item number 1, then in that URL you would see that query parameter ID equals 1. If we happen to be looking at list item ID 2, then the query parameter would show ID equals 2. That's how it knows which specific list item we happen to be looking at. So it's important to keep that in mind because we're going to be using that functionality from our Clasys app form. So let's go back there for a moment. And now I want to show you another field that I hadn't previously talked about yet that's on this form. It's a hidden label here called LBL ID. Now by hidden, I mean simply that I have unchecked the visibility option here. So it's hidden. It's a hidden control. What this control was used for is when the form loads, it will store whatever the SharePoint list item ID is for the item that we happen to be viewing. So once again, if we were viewing list item ID 1, then this control would show the number 1 in it. If we were looking at list item ID 2, it would show 2. Now we haven't configured that functionality yet, and we'll go through that momentarily, but I wanted you to be aware of that additional control and how SharePoint works, because this all needs to be tied together, and I'll show you that here in just a few minutes. So let's go ahead and start editing our existing data source so that we can add the select command. So what you see here now is what we had done previously with our insert command. Now we'll go ahead and choose add for select. And just like before, we need to go ahead and map those fields to the columns in our SharePoint list. So we'll map company name to TXT company name, city to TXT city, and then I'll just go ahead and finish these very quickly. Find name phone. Okay. Like before, we do not have a control on this form for the demo for attachments, so we don't need to map that. But now we do need to map our ID. Since we are selecting a specific list item, we're going to have an ID value, so we'll map that to our label ID. Now, over here on the right, this is the critical part of this. This is where we provide criteria. In other words, when we go to edit or view an item, how do we know, or how do we tell the Clasys app form which item we're specifically looking at? And we do that by, in essence, telling it to display the item where the ID from the SharePoint list is equal to what is populated in our label called LBL ID. That is how we give it a filter so it knows which specific item we're looking at. Okay, so that wraps up our select command. We can click OK here. Once again, we don't have a trigger, so we need to specify something. When do we want this data to be there? Well, when the form opens, right? We want it to be there when the form loads. So once again, we'll click Add Trigger. We'll select Form Load from our list and click Create Rule. Like before, we'll take a look at that rule in a moment. And there is our trigger that was created. And now we can click Finish. Now we'll switch over to the Rule tab for a moment so that you can see we now have two rules here. Our original On Button Save, and we now have On Form Load. And if we select On Form Load, we're going to again use that built-in function called Execute Command, passing in our same data source, but this time using the select command so that we can populate those fields. Now, we do need to add the functionality to populate our label called LBLID. How do we do that? We're going to add another action. And what do we want to do? We want to set that label's value, right? So we'll do label ID, that value is equal to, now once again, Places has a built-in function called query string, which is used to pull items from a URL, query string parameters. And we know that that query string we want is called ID. That's the name of that specific query string parameter that will contain the list item ID that we're looking at. Okay, so there we go. So now when the form loads, we'll execute this command, query string. It looks at the URL, finds a query string parameter called ID, takes that value and stores it into our label called LBLID. Now, of course, we want this to happen before we load the form, so we're just going to move this up above this one, and now we have everything set the way we need. So we've got our select command of the data source set. We have our label ID populated. The next step is we now have to set this particular form to be used in our SharePoint list. So we need to save this form, and then we also need to check it in. So we'll finish that process. And now what we'll do is flip back over to our list. We'll go to the List tab. We'll go to Places App Forms, but instead of choosing Manage List Forms, we're going to choose App Form Settings. And what this allows us to do is specify which forms we want for View, Edit, and New Forms. So right now we're strictly talking about View for the moment. So we'll click on this Manage App Form button for the View form. And from our Creating Data Sources option here, we'll click on New Form and select. There's our form, and we'll save that. That puts us back to our list. So now if I choose the ellipses and choose View Item, you will see that it's populated the data into our Places app form as expected. Now remember, we didn't set anything for edit, right? We only set a form for view at the moment. So just to show you, if I go here and choose edit, what this does is launch our default SharePoint form. Right? So we haven't got there yet. We're going to configure all that momentarily, but I just want to show you the difference. So let's cancel that. All right, now the last step is to provide the update command to our data source so that once we are displaying an item, we have the ability to edit that data and save it back. So let's take a look at that. Okay, so the first thing that we need to do is check out our form so that we can make our design changes and save those changes. And now we need to edit our data source again, so click on the Edit Data Source button. Again, here is our Insert and Select, so now I'll choose our Update command, and let's add that. And just as before, we need to map those fields, so I will go through and do those very briefly. Now remember, as this is an update, what is in these fields becomes the data that is pushed to the list when we make the update or make the save for the update, right? So because the ID value is something that is supplied by SharePoint list, we won't need to populate that or map that field, right? Because that's not going to change. That's going to stay the same. Now, once again, just like the select, we need to apply a filter or query criteria so that we're updating the right item. So we'll once again choose ID equals our label ID field. Okay, so that takes care of our update command. Once again, we need to add a trigger just as before, and we want this to happen when the user clicks the Save button after modifying a particular list item. So we will add again our button Save, but there's going to be a change here, and I'll show you that in just a moment. So we'll click the Create Rule button, and now we have our trigger, and we are now finished with our update command as well. But let's take a look at what's happened with the rules. One thing that you'll notice here now is we have an on button save 1, right? So it doesn't add it to the existing one, it does create a new one for us. So what I typically do is add that to the original button save so that we have just one rule for what we're doing here. So I will choose a copy, or we can actually do a cut. I'll choose a cut, go here to button save, right click on our rule and do a paste. So there's our two commands to execute our data source. You'll see again the first one is the insert command and this one is the update command. But right now, the way that this rule is designed, these will run back to back. The insert will run and then the update will run, and that's obviously not correct either. So what we need to do is add a condition here to determine which of these commands for our data source is going to be executed. Do we want the insert to run or do we want the update to run? How do we determine that? Well, let's think back to the design. Remember, when we are editing an existing item, this hidden label will be populated with the list ID for that item. So if we're editing an existing item, we know that we are going to need to do an update to save those changes. So what we can do over here in our rule is let's add a condition or a decision, and let's do if label ID dot value is not empty. If it's not empty, we know that we have edited an existing item. So what we can then do is choose to move our update to that particular decision. And then what we can do is again add a new decision that if label ID is empty, then we know that we have created a new item and we'll move that action to that decision. There we go. I have made a mistake, so let me delete that. Okay, so now when the button save is clicked, when the user gets done filling in or updating an existing item, we'll click the save. We will run through this very briefly. We'll check this particular test, condition or decision, whatever you want to phrase that as. And if our label ID hidden field is not empty, then we will execute our command, our data source, dscompanyinfo, and call the update command. But if it is empty, then we will execute the same data source, but this time calling the insert. Okay, so now that we have that finished, the last thing again that we need to do here is to use this list, these modifications now, to our SharePoint list for our edit and new form. So let's save this and let's check it in. Okay, now let's go back to our list, and once again we'll choose the list tab, we'll choose app form settings here, and we'll set our other form. We're using all Clasys app forms now for both the view and the edit, as well as then the new form. So remember, prior on our view we had already selected that, so now we'll choose edit form, we'll do the same thing, and we'll also do this for our new form as well. So now we are using our form that we've designed for a new item, viewing, and editing. Okay, let's see if all of this works. Let's add a second item. So again, we'll create a new item. And now this time we are getting a blank form, which makes sense. So we'll add a new company here. All right. And I have no idea what the area code is there, so we'll just fake something completely. Let's save that. And then if this worked, now obviously our form's not closing because I did not add that functionality in. Let's refresh this, and there is our new company, our DEF company. Now let's edit this particular record by choosing edit. Again, we're launching the Clasys app form. It loads the correct data. Let's change our zip code to 51234, and let's choose save again, and let's go back to that, refresh, and our zip code was indeed updated. So a number of steps, but it is relatively simple to create your own data source, add the appropriate commands that you need for that data source, in other words, insert, select, and update, map the fields from your form to the particular SharePoint list where you want to save that data, and this can be any list, because what we can do now is we could actually use this form in a list as we've done here. We could add this form to a SharePoint site ASPX page and implement functionality to allow the user to enter data from that page, say, but if they need to edit an item, they'll come here to the list, or implement complete functionality so that when they load that page, they can choose items from the list and perform everything there without the user ever coming to this particular SharePoint list. I hope you found this video to be beneficial. We are going to be producing more of these how to type videos in the coming weeks and months, so be sure to check our website often for new demonstrations. You can find all of our videos at http://www.clasys.com/pages/viewdemo.aspx. If there is a video you would like to see that is currently not on our site, please let us know by sending an email to info@clasys.com, and we will do our best to get one created for you. Again, I hope you found this video to be of benefit, and thank you for using Clasys App Forms.